You wanted to know how I got into this field. It began with languages. I had a talent for languages, and as a young teenager, I was lucky to go to a school where I could study not only French, but Latin. And then when I went to college, my very first course was ancient Greek. And being fascinated with language and literature and so forth, I continued up to getting a BA in classics and even an MA. Then when I wanted to eventually go back to graduate school, I was living in New York City, and I happened to open the catalog. This was when we had paper catalogs that you could look through page by page. So I just happened to open to the pages for the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Literatures. And the first course in the alphabetical list was Akkadian. And I thought to myself, Akkadian? I remember about that. I remember about Sargon of Akkad from my ancient history teacher, John Jameson, the same class, the same school where I studied Latin, and in fact the same teacher. He also taught ancient history, and he taught a very good ancient history course that started with Sumer and concluded with the fall of Rome over the course of a year. Well, so I continued reading this course catalog, and after Akkadian came Arabic and Aramaic and eventually Persian and Turkish and all sorts of other courses, and also Sumerian, and I thought to myself, I remember Sumerian. John Jameson taught us about that too. Now that would be fun to study. I believe the last course listed must have been Ugaritic, and I thought, I have no idea what that is. I bet not a lot of people know about this stuff. I think I'll study that. So, at the time, also, I was thought I was interested in religion and mythology, and I thought, oh, wouldn't it be interesting to study the most ancient myths, the most ancient religions that we know about from written texts. So that was what drew me into the field to start with, was my interest in languages, in extinct languages, the deader the better, and in mythology, which was an interest I eventually abandoned for much more down-to-earth things. I ended up writing a dissertation, broadly speaking, in social and economic history, but often everything's interconnected, so one gets back to literature and religion and mythology and poetry, even from such mundane things as bureaucratic documents.
What's it like to have a gift for languages?
I find it a lot of fun because if I'm in a foreign country and I don't know the language, I can pick a little bit of it up pretty quickly. And it's an intellectual pleasure, besides being, of course, a tool for communication and a way to relate to people.
And was it school where you discovered that you could do this pretty well?
Yeah.
Okay. So, and what pushed you towards dead languages?
Oh, perhaps because I was an antisocial child, and it was easier to deal with texts than people.
That seemed. I was officed across from a classics department for quite a while, and that seemed to be the spirit of the classics department.
Yes, well, it is an affliction of some academic fields, and not one of which we should be proud, of course. And indeed, the more you study, even if what you're studying are cuneiform tablets that are 2,500 years old or twice that, these are objects that were made by people that document their concerns, their activities, their needs, their aspirations, and so we are indeed interacting with people after all.
Well, my sense of the classics department across the hall uh, was that it was a very tight community of people who shared this interest that great numbers of their fellow students couldn't begin to understand or share,
Mm-hmm.
and that that was kind of important. It was both, in some sense, an antisocial group and a supremely tight social group all at once.
Yeah, that can happen. People make an in-group because, of course, we're most easily able to communicate with the people who share the same body of knowledge, at least some part of it. So if we all know Greek, then Greek forms a touchstone for how we can understand each other. If we all know how to read cuneiform, likewise. Now that may seem strange to someone who doesn't do this sort of work, but knowledge of a particular body of material and interest in that material and all of the fluency that you develop in the course of studying it does indeed create an internal community.
How did you handle, or did you have to handle, the anxiety about practical life as a classics major?
Well, initially as a classics major I was quite young, and handling practicalities was not a major, let's say, not as much of my concern as it is now. As I proceeded through graduate school, it was indeed challenging to balance the fairly arcane course of study on which I had embarked with the mundane realities of everyday life. However, there are many ways in which the kinds of things that I study match the kinds of concerns we still have, the sorts of documents that we still handle and produce in our everyday lives are similar in kind, if not in their form, to the kinds of documents that I study from long ago, in many cases. So at present, for example, I'm writing an article that has to do with how you refinance your mortgage in the late Bronze Age. Nowadays, almost every household deals at one point or another with how to refinance a mortgage in the present. Now, our clay tablets from the late Bronze Age, from approximately 3,500 years ago, the mortgage document is a lot less, it has far fewer pages. It's basically one tablet normally, not umpteen pages as our present-day mortgage documents are. So in that sense, it's actually easier to deal with cuneiform documents than with modern documents, and I find them more readable myself. Another example is when I take my students to see the small collection of cuneiform tablets that we have at the University of Minnesota. They're part of the library's special collections and rare books. These are little tablets. They're about the size of a small Post-it pad, most of them. Some are larger. These are not literary tablets. We don't have an exemplar of any tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, or any other work of literature. We just have some examples of two kinds of texts. One is mundane bureaucratic documents, and the other is a type of short royal inscription that was placed in the foundations of a building to attest who built it. In the case of the administrative documents, they bear seals, which corresponds to either seals or signatures in our present-day usage. They bear text, which is often quite formulaic, but it is not difficult to teach students at least the rudiments of how to read that text. And they can easily recognize numbers, for example, and usually when they're looking at these cuneiform tablets, at some point a student will notice the tablet, the clay, is impressed with fingerprints. And they can place their finger exactly where the ancient scribe placed his. So it's almost as if they can touch the scribe who made the tablet 4,000 years ago through that fingerprint. And this not only, it's almost literally putting present-day students in touch with long-ago scribes. It brings the document itself into the present moment in a way that students tend to find quite appealing.
That first course, those first courses, Jameson's courses.
I always like to give credit to my long-ago teacher, John Jameson.
How did they work, and why did they work so well?
He was interested in the subject. There wasn't really a textbook for a junior high school class in ancient history. So he studied up himself and told us all about what he had found out.
This is junior high.
Yeah.
Wow.
It was in 8th grade.
So he was sort of learning along with you to some extent.
Yeah.
So how long have people been able to read these tablets?
For a bit more than a century and a half. The story goes back, the story of present-day decipherment of cuneiform, as well as Egyptian hieroglyphics, goes back to the early to mid-19th century of our era, when European explorers went to the Near East, which we now call the Middle East, and not only did they go to Egypt and find hieroglyphic inscriptions there and copy them, or sometimes take examples back home, but they also went to the land of Iraq and identified places they'd like to excavate for curiosity, basically, and part of their exploration. The site that must have been ancient Nineveh was identified, and it was excavated by first a French archaeologist in the first half of the 19th century of this era, and the site of ancient Kalhu, whose modern name is Nimrud, was also identified, and it was excavated by an Englishman named Austin Henry Layard. In the meantime, in western Iran, the site of Behistun was explored. It's also called Bisitun. This site is where a Persian king, Darius I, placed essentially a giant billboard in 3 languages, announcing his accomplishments. Now, it's way too high up to read from the nearby road. Nevertheless, it was inscribed in what were clearly 3 different languages and 3 different sections of this giant cliff face. And there was an illustration of the king and the series of 9 rebel kings whom he conquered, and the image of what we know as Ahura Mazda's disc floating above the scene. And by a combination of luck and clever insight, scholars in the early 19th century figured out that one of the 3 languages of this inscription must be Old Persian. They didn't know what the other 2 were, and that the inscription, that simpler one, the one that was in Old Persian, it was written in an alphabetic or quasi-alphabetic script. This was at the same time that European scholars were interested in texts in Old Persian, like the Avesta, and based on their developing knowledge of the stages of the Persian language, and on the correct guess, as it turned out, that this must be a monument of Darius I, king of Persia. One scholar after another, working in concert, they were able to figure out that what the inscription must say, and to match pieces of their guesses, essentially, with the actual text. here's how they did it. They also were well trained in the classics, and they were reading Herodotus, the 5th century Greek historian who wrote of the Persian Wars. And so they took the information about the Persian dynastic succession and about the Persian Wars from Herodotus, and knowing the genealogy of Darius I, king of Persia, they matched the name of Darius, his father, his lineage, to the text of the inscription they were looking at, and by trial and error, they figured out what this long-dead script was recording. That is, they figured out how to match symbol to sound and how to identify syllables and words, and working from sign to sign, word to word, one bit to the next. They ended up working out the whole of the Old Persian script, which again was quasi-alphabetic. Based on that, they were able to decipher the other two texts, which they knew that it must be a trilingual, that is to say, 3 languages giving the same text. And so extrapolating from the Old Persian version, they worked out what turned out to be the Babylonian text, and the third one was Elamite. Elamite was a language spoken in ancient Iran for perhaps as long as 3 millennia, until the time of the Persian Empire, in the late 1st millennium BCE. And the Babylonian language was a dialect of what we generally call Akkadian. It's a Semitic language, and so it was possible to work out an understanding of the language based on comparison with other Semitic languages. The script, meanwhile, was completely unknown to start with at the beginning of this process, but by working backward from having deciphered the Old Persian version to working out the signs of the different script, the cuneiform script in which the Babylonian text was written, also the Elamite, scholars were gradually able to assign values to each of the signs of that script. They're polyvalent, that is, each sign has more than one value, typically. So this was not an uncomplicated process, but gradually they were able to work out a good deal of the information necessary in order to actually read the text and grasp the language in which it was written. And then they could apply the same knowledge to other texts. And so in the meantime, Austin Henry Layard at Nimrud and Paul-Émile Botta at Nineveh and other excavators too were finding many cuneiform inscriptions. And at Nimrud and Nineveh, these were Assyrian inscriptions. So they applied the same information about the values of the signs and the content of the language, and made it possible to read the cuneiform script and read the languages that it wrote. This breakthrough occurred in 1856, and the study of the ancient Near East basically was opened up and made possible from that moment, as this knowledge, the decipherment of the script and the knowledge gained therefrom was built upon, and more cuneiform tablets, inscriptions, sites, monuments were excavated and are continuing to be excavated to this day.
So, 150 years later, do we have a grammar and a dictionary that we can rely on?
We do indeed. We have a very large dictionary, and if you turned the camera around, you would see that it's about 21 volumes, all lined up above my desk, and that's our dictionary of the Akkadian language. There is a 3-volume dictionary next to it, and there's a 1-volume dictionary as well. For Sumerian, we still don't have a comprehensive dictionary. People are working on it. For other languages written in cuneiform, the story is a little bit different depending on the language. So the decipherment or the Hittite was one of the other languages written in cuneiform, and it's an Indo-European language. The script had already been deciphered. All that remained to be done really was to work out what language was it that was written in this script. And for Hittite, we have 3 dictionaries and a big comprehensive one in progress. And for other ancient Near Eastern languages, which are less well known, we're a little farther behind. Elamite, for example, which I mentioned already, it's one of the 3 languages of the inscription of Darius I at Bisitun. Elamite is not that well known compared to Akkadian or even Sumerian or Hittite, because it is not certain what modern relative it may have. It might possibly be related to the Dravidian language family. I don't believe this is a matter of consensus among scholars who work on that yet. But what that means, since it doesn't have known relatives, is that, and there aren't many bilinguals, Elamite is not as well known as the others. Sumerian, for that matter, is also, it has no known relatives. It is, as far as we are aware, a linguistic isolate. And that's what hinders progress on working out the grammar and the dictionary, because we've got no comparative material, although we do have a great number of bilinguals and, indeed, scholarly materials produced by the cuneiform scribes themselves in antiquity in the course of teaching their writing system, the languages that it was used to write, and the body of scientific and scholarly literature that was part of their stream of tradition. In the process, they produced vocabularies, sign lists, even grammatical tables, as well as other types of materials in order to teach each generation of new scribes. And that has been a resource for modern scholars to do exactly the same thing.
And just to get an idea, do you have a sense, I mean, not even to the 1,000, but how large the vocabulary is in these languages?
That's a difficult question to answer, partly because, of course, every language changes over time, and some vocabulary words drop out of use, or they may change their meaning, while other vocabulary words come into use, or maybe languages borrow a good deal of vocabulary from other languages. English is a dramatic example of that kind of phenomenon. So it's really difficult to estimate what is the working vocabulary at any given time, but it's certainly as large as any modern language.
So, did they say for Shakespeare 32,000?
Mm-hmm.
Is it reasonable to think that people were working with a 30,000+ word vocabulary?
Sure. Not everybody would have needed all that vocabulary, of course, but certainly the composers of works of literature did, and because if you're a poet, you want a lot of synonyms. They would draw upon the full resources of their language in order to compose poetry in Akkadian or Sumerian or Hittite or Hurrian, for that matter.
And on the other hand, if you're working with people with limited vocabularies in your language, you're probably going to keep it pretty simple.
Not necessarily. There are specialized vocabularies for each kind of text. So we have, to give one example, we have lots and lots of legal documents from the ancient Near East, broadly speaking, from ancient Mesopotamia, Syria, the Levant more broadly. And legal documents have their own special vocabulary. So for those purposes, we, like the ancient scribes, have to learn the particular legal vocabulary of whichever region it is that produced the documents we're studying.
So, where is your specialty with regard to this work with texts? what kind of puzzle solving work is most attractive to you?
One kind of work that appeals to me is to see beneath the ostensible message of a text to what motivated the production of that text. And usually that means not considering any one text in isolation, but considering each text in its larger context in relation to either other similar texts or in the context of an archive or in relation to comparable literary works, for example, so that one can either, if it's a matter of practical affairs, such as legal documents, then one can discover why is it that the people to whom this archive belonged generated these texts with these transactions involving those other people during this period of time. What were they doing? Not just what do their texts say, but what were they doing to produce those texts? What did they intend? And how come they left them behind where we could find them? How does it happen that these survived for us? Because that doesn't go without saying. They could have been recycled. Clay could be remanufactured into new tablets, and then we would have some other texts, but not those. So answering those kinds of contextual questions, these are historical questions, really, and that's why we learn to read texts. But it isn't based, it's not limited just to the reading of texts. If it's literary texts, then we want to discover the web of allusions, both to other literary texts and also to the realities of the life that people lived when these were produced, when they were heard, because after all, poetry was originally sung, not read. And so what we regard as literature was what probably was performed and heard originally.
That's when I was starting my graduate school time, there was this new thinking about the Homeric poems, and the idea was that these were performed from memory for a very long time before they got written down, and that one could understand them as kind of collections of performances in various ways. Do you understand these literary texts in the same way that there's a sort of a long oral tradition, and at a certain point, for one reason or another, that oral tradition gets down in clay?
Yes, and the reasons can be very different. So I'll offer a few different examples. We'll start with the Epic of Gilgamesh because that is the one work of Mesopotamian literature that most people have heard of. As most people have probably read, if they know about the Epic of Gilgamesh, in its standard form, which is the version that was written during the early 1st millennium BCE, maybe the late 2nd actually, if we credit the scribe, author Sinleke Unini, who's named in the colophon. This epic consisted of 12 tablets. We don't have all of those 12 tablets, although we do have many exemplars of different manuscripts of this version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, as well as earlier versions, from many different sites. But we still don't have the whole thing. And indeed, only recently, a scholar whose specialization is in this literature figured out that two that we thought were tablets 4 and 5, two pieces that we thought were supposed to belong to tablets 4 and 5, needed to be reversed, tablets 5 and 4. So that gives you an idea of the incompleteness of even this best known work of Mesopotamian literature. But then you might be wondering, why do we have so many manuscripts, so many exemplars, but not the whole? We have so many exemplars of Tablet 1 or Tablet 11, that's the tablet in which Gilgamesh hears the story of the flood, and we have fewer exemplars of the other tablets. This was used as a text to train scribes. So scribes who were in training, they were, let's say, the cuneiform equivalent of undergraduate students. And so they got to a point in their capacity to write cuneiform and to write Akkadian. They got to a point where they could copy works of literature. So they might copy an excerpt from Tablet 1 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, or they might copy an excerpt from another tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Well, what this tells us is that this story, this epic, it had a place in the school curriculum, but this does not tell us whether it had a place outside the school curriculum. So a point of discussion among scholars is whether indeed the Epic of Gilgamesh was really as popular in antiquity as it is today. Or that is, did people tell this story over the hearth, or was it recited at court? We're not sure. There are other kinds of literature that we are more certain of the context of recitation. For example, hymns and lamentations that were performed in temples. These are written down with explicit indications of how they're to be performed, what musical mode they're to be performed in, where you are supposed to play what chord, and things like that. Then there's a lot of other literature that we might guess has a context of recitation at court. A certain amount of Sumerian literature, for example, seems to have been produced in the context of the court in the late 3rd millennium, and we imagine it was probably recited in that context. Sung, in fact, most likely. And some other works of literature are also explicitly labeled song, or just like Hesiod and Homer in the Greek tradition. Those poems open with the injunction to sing. So do some Mesopotamian poems. They are identified as to be sung. And this is also true if we move westward into Anatolia, where there are distinct poetic traditions which were written down. When they were written down using cuneiform script on clay tablets. So, and we're lucky that they did that, because we have them to read, or we have them usually in broken pieces, as cuneiform tablets seldom survive whole, especially not large literary tablets. And in that context, we also have indications of oral performance and the identification of certain works as songs. One that I have studied and worked on is very intriguing because it bears the ancient title Song of Liberation. It was perhaps composed before the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE, and it was composed in the Hurrian language. Hurrian is a language I haven't yet mentioned. It is another near isolate among the languages of the ancient Near East. It has no certain modern relative. The only relative known for Hurrian is Urartian, which is even less well known. So Hurrian is a language we've known about for 100 years, because words in Hurrian, the name of the Hurrian language, people identified by Hurrian names are pretty common in the 2nd millennium BCE and in the ancient Near East. But we didn't have any bilinguals of any length for most of the last century. until in 1983, in the excavations of the Hittite capital city Hattusha at the site of Boğazköy in central Turkey. Excavations which proceed even today. They have been going on for almost the whole century, the entire century since before World War I. So the excavations in 1983 turned up in one of many buildings identified as a temple. Excavations there turned up a collection of broken pieces of tablets which were clearly bilingual. They're formatted in two columns. The left column is in Hurrian, and the right column is in Hittite. And it's clear, simply from the format, even before you read a word, that this is a bilingual tablet in which the original text and the translation are lined up side by side. For those who know classical literature and the way the classical texts are published, it's just like you're holding a Loeb edition in cuneiform, with Hurrian on one side, Hittite on the other, all lined up paragraph by paragraph, and the scribes drew formatting lines on the tablet to define where the paragraphs were. Hittite scribes who wrote these tablets also were very careful to leave spaces between words, and that's very helpful to the modern reader as it must have been to the ancient reader. Well, these bilingual tablets, they weren't alone. They were in a collection of other tablets, some of which were in Akkadian, some in Hittite, some in other languages, and these Hurrian Hittite bilingual tablets proved to contain two different compositions. One was a collection of parables, which are like long proverbs, little stories, sort of like Aesop's fables, if you want to think of a comparison with a type of text people know. The other composition was this Song of Liberation. We know its title because the Hittite scribes wrote the title in a colophon, Song of Liberation, Tablet 1 or Tablet 5. And unfortunately, because these tablets were, for the most part, broken into pieces in antiquity in the course of the eventual destruction of the building where they were stored, we can't put together the whole text. Not every tablet's colophon survives, and so it's been somewhat laborious to determine how to put the pieces back together and in what order does the poem go. But it's interesting, first of all, that it was identified as a song. Second, that it was recorded in a bilingual edition. Based on the paleography, that is the shape of the writing, the form of the script, and also based on the date of the building in which it was found, the texts themselves, the tablets, can be dated to 1400 BCE, approximately. The composition must have been older, much older. The dialect of Hurrian that is used seems to be relatively archaic for the period of the tablets. And here's the story it tells. It begins with a poem introducing the gods and humans who are the principal characters of the story. The gods include the storm god, Teshub in Hurrian, and goddess Alani, the goddess of the underworld, Bolt of the netherworld she is called, and also the goddess Ishara, who was worshipped in the area that is now Syria during the Bronze Age. And the human characters include a mysterious personage named Pisikara of Nineveh. And unfortunately, we don't quite know who he was because whatever would tell us that is in the missing pieces of the manuscripts. And a king named Maki. And before I go on, I have to clarify that we wouldn't be able to read this without the Hittite translation because, as I mentioned, Hurrian is a relatively poorly known language. But with the Hittite translation, we're able to work out the Hurrian poem too. And in fact, that might be why these poems, this particular poem as well as the parables, were written down to begin with, perhaps they were used as a kind of final exam for Hittite scribes who were learning Hurrian in 1400 BC. Well, again, they can serve a similar purpose for us. So on the one hand, we can learn Hurrian thanks to the efforts of Hittite scribes 3,400 years ago. Second place, we can read this intriguing poem, at least the pieces of it that survive, that we've been able to put together. And the central problem with which the story in the poem deals is that one city, the city of Ebla, has subordinated the people of another city, the city of Igingalish. And the gods have decided that the subordination of the people of Igingalish must end. The king of Ebla, the people of Ebla, must release those people. And so in one tablet of which we have a substantial part, the storm god Teshub is conveying this demand in a long monologue to the king Megi, king of Ebla. Teshub utilizes a great deal of metaphorical language, and he also details the generations of kings who have been served by the people of Ebla, the people of Igingalish and their leader Pura. He says, so-and-so was king, and Pura stood before him and served him. And then he went to his fate, and so became king in his stead. And this goes on based on the eventual number. It must have been 9 kings, although, again, the tablet's broken. We don't have the entirety of the story. It continues on another tablet. And then Teshub has finished speaking. The king Megi is relaying Teshub's message to the Senate of Ebla. Megi is repeating what Teshub said to him and communicating the message that Teshub delivered, which is, now you must release these people. You must release the people of Igingalish. If you do grant release, then I will make your fields prosper. I will make your weapons glorious in battle. If you don't release these people, then I will come upon you upon the 7th day, and I will smash your city. I will smash the city of Ebla like a pot. I will throw the upper city into the lower city into the hearth into the river. Actually, I recited that wrong, but never mind. And this is the message that Megi conveys from the god Teshub to the Senate of Ebla. Well, you would think that the Senate of Ebla might take heed and avoid the promised destruction of their city and say, oh, sure, we'll release those people. Time to do the God's will and release them. But no, they object. There is a speaker named Vaz Allah. He is an orator whom none can best in argument, and he stands up and speaks against the king's proposal. And he tells the king, you can release your own slave if you want. You can release your own slave woman if you want. In fact, go ahead and send your wife back to her father's house. Put your son out in the street if you want. But we will not release the people of Igingalish. They are our cupbearers. They wash our dishes. They do our laundry. They serve us. Who will do all that for us? How can we let these people go? So Megi, cowed by the Senate, goes back to Teshub, the god, prostrates himself before the god, weeping, and says, I would grant the release, but the Senate does not grant the release. That's where the tablet breaks off. There's one other tablet of which we have a substantial proportion that survives. It's hard to see where it's placed, but what it tells is the following. Teshub, the storm god, has gone to the netherworld to pay a visit to his sister Alani, the lady, bolt of the netherworld. She prepares for him a banquet and seats the old gods on his right and left, and the text goes into some detail describing how elaborate and gigantic this banquet of epic proportions is. This is an epic, after all. And unfortunately, that's all we've got. That tablet breaks off. But one might imagine perhaps Teshub was warning his sister that her realm was soon to receive a substantial population influx. For after all, around 1600 BC, the city of Ebla was indeed destroyed for good. And that probably is the event that gave rise to the composition of this poem, which perhaps was sung for generations in the vicinity of Ebla, which lies in central Syria, or in the vicinity of Igingalish, which probably lies in northern Syria, but we aren't sure quite where the site is. And perhaps through oral transmission, one way or another, knowledge of this poem, sung in Hurrian, made its way to Hatti in central Anatolia, and eventually, in the historical context of the Hittite acquisition of a large empire, starting somewhat before 1400 BCE, perhaps then questions of domination and subordination became very important to people, and this is why this poem was chosen to be recorded in a bilingual edition that we've had the luck to find.
Yeah. As you were speaking, I wanted to get the spiritual slowly rising behind you. Let my people go.
Yes.
I mean, it can't quite be an accident that this is the Exodus story. Is at least a kind of friend of the Exodus story.
It is. It is not an isolated theme by any means. And so I think you're right to hear the Exodus story as echoing this story. Not as a copy, of course, but as another poetic exposition of the same kind of theme. What is more, the very poetic imagery of the Song of Liberation in Hurrian and Hittite recurs in biblical poetry and in archaic Greek poetry too. So, for example, I quoted Teshub threatening to smash the city like a pot. That same image occurs in Israelite prophecy. And so does the theme of the deity punishing the people who have failed to obey the order to release people whom they have subordinated. In the prophets, the book of the prophet Jeremiah, in Jeremiah chapter 34, a similar episode occurs. It isn't exactly the same, but the god demands, and the king therefore issues an edict demanding the release of enslaved Judeans, and the people who have held them in slavery do obey the command to release, but then they re-enslave them, and this, according to the text of the prophet, is why Yahweh decides to destroy Jerusalem. So, in a sense, Yahweh does to Jerusalem what the storm god Teshub did to Ebla in the poem from the late Bronze Age.
Yeah. And I'm put in mind also of the bit Thucydides, the negotiation with the people in Milos, where it's a matter of, again, a more powerful political entity exploring the limits of total subjugation of a less powerful one.
Mm-hmm.
Must have happened a lot that this, with variants of power in different areas and at different times, depending on things like harvests and population and all that, and many other things, there'd always be somebody relatively up and somebody relatively down, and a range of options for setting up the relationships, including trade and tribute and enslavement. It must have been...
And also who is under whose jurisdiction.
Yeah. Yeah, and cultural appropriation. I mean, cultural domination is the kind of thing Alexander did. So there must have been, I mean, the issue of what do you do when you're more powerful as a political entity than somebody else must have been a kind of hot topic in the region for an awfully long time.
Yeah, it was. And this poem, as well as a lot of the literature within the biblical corpus, wrestles with that kind of question. What are the limits of the right to dominate, even if that right is won by conquest?
And, I mean, one has the gods coming in as the protector of the weaker party in a number of places, not in the Greek story. Is there any other kind of argument besides the gods have taken a fancy to this little town, let it go?
Yeah, there is. Actually, the larger argument is reaches much farther back into ancient Near Eastern history. The word used for release in the Song of Liberation, which I could also translate as the Song of Release, the word used for release in Hurrian is kirenzi, and the Hurrian word kirenzi translates Akkadian anduraru. The Akkadian word anduraru, in turn, translates Sumerian amargi, which literally means return to mother. Akkadian anduraru means essentially restoration, as in returning a state of affairs or returning a person to the status quo ante. That word, anduraru, is the Hebrew word deror. You can hear the similarities. The Hebrew form of the word has simply lost the prefix that the Akkadian word has. The Hebrew word deror, which again originally means restoration and refers to the act of release that restores people and their property and their situation to the status quo ante. That is the word in the quotation from Leviticus 25 on our Liberty Bell. Proclaim liberty throughout the land translates proclaim deror throughout the land. Proclaim release or restoration, or it's often translated debt remission throughout the land. Why is that? That is a divine command in the biblical context and also in its broader ancient Near Eastern context, because although the gods do not prohibit conquest, they do not prohibit creditors taking your property or even you as security for debt. They don't prohibit those things, but all of these kinds of constraint and domination must have a limit. And that limit is reached either following a certain period of time or upon the proclamation of release, anduraru, or Hebrew deror, Sumerian amargi, Hurrian kirenzi. All of these words denote the same fundamental act or process of restoration to status quo ante. So, your house is mortgaged, then upon the anduraru edict, it isn't mortgaged anymore. You don't owe anything more. Your daughter has been taken as security for debt. She is released upon the anduraru edict, or the edict of deror in the Hebrew context. You have fallen into slavery, and the ruler issues an edict of release, anduraru. Now you're sprung from slavery. Since this is restoration to status quo ante, and it is done by divine command, what is the original state to which you're to be restored? It is that of freedom from encumbrance. And that applies to you, your family, your property, the entire state, the land itself. And this too, I mentioned that the imagery in the Hurrian Song of Release, translated into Hittite also, I mentioned that the imagery in that poem is echoed in archaic Greek poetry, specifically in the poems of Solon, Archon of Athens in the early 6th century BCE, who, when he set things to right in Athens, he specifically spoke in his poems of removing the boundary stones from the land, removing the constraints from the earth and its people who groaned under the constraints of debt bondage. This Solon called seisachtheia, throwing off the burdens. And it was long ago recognized that Solon's seisachtheia was none other than the Greek version of Akkadian Anduraru, or Hebrew Deror. And that's the central act that the gods demand in the Hurro-Hittite poem as well.
So, in commercial society, some people get rich and get advantages over others. You have the upstarts who push out the established families in New York and Mesopotamia. And these poems say they don't get to redo the social order. They've got to hand it back to how it was. Is that right?
Well, in a manner of speaking, that is, there's an ideal posited by this kind of literature and also by royal inscriptions as well as literature. The ideal seems to be not equality, not in our sense, that is, they're not looking for an egalitarian society, but equity. So yes, some people are rich and some people are poor. Some people rule, some people are ruled. This is fine. But each family, household should be able to thrive and prosper and thus contribute to the larger social order. That's a simple and perhaps rather banal way to put it. But this ideal, which I think is one we have for our own society in one or another sense too, this was certainly an ideal in ancient Mesopotamian and Israelite and Anatolian society too.
Thank you.